Hi, I'm Femi Oke and you're in the stream. Today, have young Japanese lost interest in dating? We look at why the number of single people not in a relationship is at an all-time high. Our digital producer Malika Valawi is always looking out for your live feedback, and if there's anything viral, Malika knows about it, which is really pertinent to our conversation today because it starts with an article that a lot of people read.
Exactly, and a lot is kind of an understatement. So I pulled up the article on my screen here. It has a very provocative title of Why Have Young People in Japan Stopped Having Sex? This is an article in the Guardian newspaper. Of course, we're going to discuss that today, but what we've been hearing from is our Japanese netizens online who say it's a little bit more nuanced than you might think. So for all of you at home watching this show, we want you to tweet in your questions and your comments. Just make sure you use the hashtag AJStream.
Now joining us in the studio, our set guest, he's already been tweeting. He's very eager. Roland Kautz is a Japanese-American writer and author of Japan America, How Japanese Pop Culture Has Invaded the US. Roland, great to have you here.
Thank you.
So you've been tweeting, you've been on social media about this subject. What have you been hearing?
Well, for one thing, the headline is more sensationalist than the article itself. The story is really about what I think is most interesting and what people are talking about is the fact that men and women in Japan are so far apart. And that's partly societal. It's partly the way the society is structured.
Okay, more from Roland in just a moment, but he's getting going already. So here at the stream, we like to think of ourselves as an online community that just happens to have a TV show. We love hearing from you, so share your stories that you've been following. You can do that by going to our About page, which is where I am right now, and you can find all of our Twitter handles. Here's mine, here's Malika's. More importantly, our producers down here. Tweet us your stories, your ideas, and they could be turned into future episodes.
AJ Stream is the only place that'll put your face and your voice on the air. This is Nadia Akbar, and I'm in the stream.
The celibacy syndrome. Do you know what that is? It's a term used by Japanese media to describe a national trend where young people are losing interest, not just in marriage, but in romantic relationships as well. A recent government survey found that the number of singles has reached an all-time high, with 61% of unmarried men and 49% of women aged 18 to 34 not in any kind of romantic relationship. And so, compounding the issue, Japan's death rates are routinely higher than their birth rates. In fact, fewer babies were born in 2012 than any other year on record. At this pace, Japan's government says that a third of its population will be gone by 2060. So what's causing this trend? To help us talk about this, we're joined by Mikiko Sagawa, an independent journalist. She's joining us in our Google Hangout. We also have Morley Robertson, a journalist and musician, and Tomomi Yamaguchi, Associate Professor of Anthropology at Montana State University. It's great to have you all here in the stream. I'm going to start though with Morley, musician, DJ, he's out and about, he's in Japanese culture. So Morley, you heard the stats. We actually have a syndrome name for it, the celibacy syndrome. But what's really happening as far as you're concerned?
I think it's just it's what is happening in Japan is what is happening in all developed countries. People who grew up in developed countries are actually marrying less and less. This is a trend that can be seen in the United States and Europe as well. Actually, in Europe and the United States, if I'm not mistaken, the immigrant population are the ones that are driving any sort of substantial population growth. So for me, this is sort of just a storm in a small cup. That is, the media is sort of creating and conjuring a syndrome, as far as I'm concerned.
I had a little sneak preview of Mikiko's relationship status. Let's share it with the rest of the world. Mikiko, what is it? Mikiko?
Yes?
Yes, your relationship status.
Sorry,
right
I'm sorry.
Now.
Could you give me
it's pertinent to this conversation, otherwise I wouldn't normally ask it. Mikiko, are you single? You are?
Yes, I'm single, yes.
So do you
and also I'm 32. Yeah. And just it's true, many women like my age, they're looking for the partner, but the men in Japan are more less ambitious for having the relationship. So maybe this is one of the reasons why marriage is not so successful. And also through the media, like every day almost on the TV show, that's kind of not negative campaign, but the celebrity appear on TV just describing their like divorce or like a negative side of the marriage, and why this, I don't know, maybe that's one of the reasons that's
okay.
It's
all right, Roland, you live in Tokyo and you're nodding as Makiko's talking. Jump in.
Well, I've actually had Japanese male friends say that Japanese women today are too strong. And I was nodding because Makiko was talking about Japanese men not being ambitious about their relationships. And I think this gender gap, again, is partly societal. Japanese men, because it's a largely patriarchal corporate structure, they're accustomed to just moving up in that structure, and they assume that they're going to find someone. Whereas the women, if they do get married or have a child, they often lose their careers. So the women are sort of focused on keeping their careers and advancing, and the men are sort of caught in this, career path structure that's been laid out since the bubble years.
And this losing their careers as for women, this is quite startling. Can you explain why, if you have a baby, you would just lose your career in Japan?
Well, it's just assumed societally that once you have a child, you will become a stay-at-home mother, and that you're no longer able to do the kind of productive work that you did before having a child.
Right.
So you're kind of edged out of a job.
Malika.
Roland mentioned those shifting gender roles and what this has to do with the economy, and I'd like, of course, our community to pick up on that. But before that happens, Tomomi, I want you to address two of these tweets we got from a Japan resident. Yuritam says, in Japan, there's a tendency to consider romantic relationships a hassle. She mentions the Japanese word for it. And she also goes on to say, I don't know how general this is, but around me, it's uncool, she uses quotes, to be interested in sex or romance because they're banal. So what are your thoughts on that, and what's your take on what's actually happening?
Well, could you repeat the Japanese word that you just mentioned again?
I actually didn't even try. She says it's a hassle.
It's mendokusai. Mendokusai.
Mendokusai. Oh, okay. So you're asking what's going on?
Yes.
The mendokusai situation.
And if that's true, if you agree with this tweeter.
Well, I currently don't live in Japan, so I really can't speak for all the Japanese women, certainly. And but of course, having relationship with someone is kind of mendokusai, and it's not limited to Japanese people. It's probably mendokusai for everybody in the world because it really requires certain amount of energy, certain amount of kind of, you have to spend time, you have to spend all those kind of, possibly some career compromise as well. So, I guess it's happening, it may be happening in Japan, but it's probably happening elsewhere.
So Molly, there's an intimate part of this conversation that we can't really avoid. So if we're looking at perhaps sexual patterns or sexual habits changing in Japan, not that you would be an expert on this subject, but just as, I don't even want to say as a voyeur, but as somebody who's been living in Japan for such a long time, can you see that maybe young people are relating to each other in a different way intimately?
No, actually, I think that they're relating to each other intimately like they were 20 or 30 years ago, as far as I can remember. It's just that there's, social media and more media intervention, media interference. People talk to each other about, stuff, memes on the social network and stuff. So basically what I'm saying is that there's a homogenizing dynamic here where everybody ends up sort of speaking about the same thing because the information, travels laterally, horizontally. So I think that's why these new phrases such as, asexuality or sexlessness or celibacy syndrome, they're just woven into the conversation, but it's all part in jest, in my opinion. It's just a kind of verbal banter. So I'm not really reading a serious situation emerging out of all this.
Well, Roland,
sorry to bother you, but I'm sorry. Based on my experience, I dated with many. There's a huge gap about in terms of sexual greediness. I'm sorry, my English is limited, but say between generation. Let's say the man like 50 to 60 in Japanese, they're very ambitious. You understand, they are more masculine. They spend more money. Also, they spend more sexual energy. But like young students nowadays, they are really asexual.
So Makiko, you are seeing a generational
like
difference in
vegetarians,
basically, in the way that an older generation of man is much more different from a younger generation of man. Interesting. So there's a different,
especially baby boomers.
Yeah. So
definitely.
So you're seeing it differently from Morley, which is great because we want all these perspectives.
Can I respond here?
Yeah, go ahead, Morley.
That feminism has taken. Feminism has taken root in Japanese society to some degree. It has indigenized, it has become a Japanese form of feminism, not as explicit as in the West. So women are indeed stronger, but I do think that there is a sort of a sexually assertive stream in the younger generation of women. So when you say, people are less sexual in the younger generation, maybe you're talking about the men, the so-called, vegetable-eating men or so forth. But I think that the women...
not only men,
no?
even women.
You're saying women are asexual?
Yeah, they want a baby, but they don't want a husband.
They want to have sex. They want to have fun.
Yeah, they want, because look at
the way they dress is very sexualized.
Okay.
Really? No.
So Molly and Makiko, I'm just going to stop you for a moment because Molly, you said the so-called vegetable-eating man. So we need a little bit of a pause here. I'm going to show you.
Yes, I can give you.
I'll show you a character here on my laptop, and he's got big eyes and he's very handsome, or maybe I should say very beautiful. And there's a certain style of man who's probably more in touch with his feminine side, and there's a phrase for that. Molly, do you want to explain the phrase and give the rest of the world a little insight into what you're talking about?
Oh, you mean the herbivore?
Herbivore.
Right?
What is a herbivore man?
A herbivore man is a non-carnivore man, a man who doesn't eat meat, and that's a symbolic term meaning, the more genteel, less aggressive, and less ambitious, like a brontosaurus opposed to tyrannosaurus. They don't attack, they don't go after the women aggressively, they don't have that much libido because they're content eating the low-hanging fruit. I think that's the image.
So what are you a meat eater or a herbivore, Molly?
I am definitely a dripping red meat eater.
Right.
A rare please.
Because like a man like him, like age 40 or 50, is just meat eater.
Right.
But say 20, 30, they're really vegetarian. Just because I met many, like my mother just sent me a marriage counseling, like marriage agency. I encountered like 5 or 6 vegetarian guys just.
All right, so Makiko, we hear your issues. Let's head back to the community.
Well, it's interesting because I'm hearing sort of a generational divide there, but our community is raising another issue. They say a lot of this has to do with the economy. And Roland, there's a tweet here from Sashi who says, most feel it's not economical to get married. Life in Tokyo is expensive. Expectations from women are high. That's what this person says. I know some will debate that. But there's also a video comment. I'd like you to have a listen to this.
I don't think it's quite accurate to say Japanese people are not interested in relationships. Many of my single friends are looking for a stable partner, complaining they don't have opportunity. Conservative mentality regarding women may also be blamed for the lack of tendency to look for casual love life. I think what's really going on is that people cannot afford to have relationships, and many men give up on looking for it, and they hide in the sex industry in Japan.
So Roland, what she says is that they're giving up because they can't afford it.
Yeah, and I think there's obviously some truth to that. It is a very expensive country, not only the city of Tokyo. There's also something I'd like to add about this generation gap, because the older generation of men, especially if you get up into the 50s and 60s, they were the hard-working salarymen who became famous worldwide for being, like warriors in the business class. And a lot of them were not home. So their children grew up with these absent fathers who were constantly at the office or at the drinking party afterwards, or even traveling to other cities to work. And I think some of those young men don't want to be like that. And maybe some of the young women don't want their husbands to be like that. And so there's also, I think, a gap, partly due to the fact that those men worked so incredibly hard and were never fathers.
So it's a cognizant push to not be like our parents, basically.
Right, and in a way it's an anti-materialistic push as well, because I know a lot of young students who I taught at the University of Tokyo, they definitely they wanted a job, but they didn't want the kind of career that their fathers had.
See, what I'm finding very fascinating, I think what a lot of outsiders find fascinating, is I'm looking at some young men and they're hugging pillows of women. And then we've also got some incredibly lifelike women/dolls, which are also, we'll show you the pictures of those in just a moment, which is also maybe an alternative to the messiness of a relationship. What was it called?
Medoksai.
Medoksai, okay.
Yeah.
Medoksai. I should use that in my life.
Yes.
Medoksai. So we have dolls, which you could have, and there's also a virtual game called Love Plus.
Yes.
I mean, you can have avoid Medoksai completely by just having a virtual relationship. How much is this playing into the idea of young people maybe not wanting to hook up so much?
Well, we have to be a little bit careful because the dolls and the pillows that certain men are hugging,
yes,
and even the dating sims, it's a limited group.
Okay.
You know, it's not by any means mainstream Japanese who are hugging pillows or playing dating sims.
Yeah.
But I do think it hits upon another element of Japanese culture, which is that what we think of as the border between reality and the imagination or the imaginative world, I've always felt is a bit more porous in Japanese life and culture than we tend to think about it in the West.
Sure.
So that, if you have a dating sim and you're investing it with your imagination, one can imagine engaging.
I like the one can imagine. Have you ever played Love Plus?
I've played it. I mean, I've sampled it. Yes.
Okay.
I've not gotten involved with anyone.
Okay. So let me just move us just a little bit further on in the conversation. Mikiko actually is an independent journalist. Yeah. She did some reporting for us. She went out and about in Tokyo to ask young people about marriage and relationships. Have a listen to what they told her.
例えばその結婚に求めているものが変わってきたからだと思うんですよね。やっぱり女の人も自立して自分で好きなものを買えるようになったので、結婚して誰かに養ってもらいたいという気持ちがなくなってきたのかな。結婚っていう形を取らなくてもいいんじゃないのかな。例えばフランスとかだと結婚しない、そのない、まあ家の妻みたいなのスタイルの方が多いじゃないですか。多分アメリカとかも多くて、多分そういうのが日本でも増えてきたというか。
女性の方が収入が上がってきちゃってるんで、結婚まで踏み切れない人が多い。なんか自分のが気が小さくなったので、仕事もやりながら子育てが多分できない時代じゃないですか。もうストレス溜まったってよく聞くんで、そうなってる社会だったらもう男の人がそこを支えるしかないんですけど、それができないっていうのが見えてるからこそ、子供産むのがなんか嫌だな、難しそうだな。
結婚すると自分のお金も2人分にしなきゃいけないから、そういう煩わしいことをなるべく遠ざけると結婚が遅くなるかなって、自分のやりたいことを満たしてから結婚しようかなって思うんで、40代だったりとか30過ぎたから。
So Mikiko, did nobody want to get married? There's so many reasons people didn't want to get married. They couldn't afford it. It was too complicated. Was that really representative of everybody that you spoke to?
I think, I believe that's, but the thing that's common for all of us is just, there's so many things that, unlike before, like my mother's age, marriage cannot be a prioritized issue because nowadays a woman, like as they describe, can afford life, we can buy whatever we want, we become independent. So there are more things that we can be more individualistic, like egoistic, and not egoistic, how can I say, we can pursue our own dreams, pursue our own lives, but the thing just, they're afraid is just by getting married to somebody, their life gonna be minimized or diminished, or like you have to make a lot of compromise.
Okay.
So I think the things, and also they agree, even though they don't share it, they didn't reveal it on the TV interview, but they say young men not so, how can I say, it's not positively looking for You understand? They are not.
All right, let's bring in the community here. We understand you perfectly.
Yeah.
Well, our community here seems to be shifting this to look at the global impact as well as the national impact. So I'm going to read you 2 Facebook comments. Clay says, if you talk to Japanese people about the decreasing birth rate, you'll find that most are freaked out about it. He says, no people equals no taxes, which equals no pensions. On the other hand, Amy says, if increasing population growth is a global worry, maybe the Japanese are just a step ahead of all the others in seeking to redress the global population outlook. Morley, can you elaborate on those 2 strands of conversation?
Yeah, I think that the population explosion happening in developing countries and poor regions of the world has to do with really the lack of equal rights among women. So really this is a question of human rights, I would call it abuse, but discrepancy not favoring women, whereas in developed countries, women enjoy more equal rights and options in life, and hence, they're not bound to becoming homemakers or mothers and whatnot. So there is a general trend in developed countries for the women to delay childbirth or even forego marriage. And also, let us not forget that there's a whole diversity in sexuality. People of the same sex are marrying now in developed countries. So there are so many factors contributing there. But I do think that there is a general trend globally for the population to keep increasing in an explosive direction. When you look at the whole world, yes.
Mm-hmm. So Tomomi, if you look at this conversation as an anthropologist, how would you sum it up? What do you think the future will be like for Japan?
Well, as an anthropologist, actually, it's more interesting to see all the reaction by the American British media on this, rather than the Japanese situation. And I'm really curious why people are so interested in somebody else's sex life, because it's really nobody's business, really.
And as an anthropologist, you must have the answer to that. Why do you think the world is so intrigued by different kinds of sexuality, particularly what's happening in Japan right now?
Well, Japan, there has been kind of the tradition of really Orientalism kind of ways to see Japan. Definitely it's working here. But also that when those media reports on Japan and they just forget about all the diverse sexualities and they tend to impose on this kind of heterosexual norm.
Right.
Which is really, really strange to me.
All right.
And also the other thing is that what's the issue about this whole, why is this pathologizing celibacy is really going on here? Is one huge kind of question that I have, and probably I'm kind of not answering your question.
You're giving me 3 questions for the post show, so I will appreciate those. We'll come back to all of those. Roland, you had a very quick question for Makiko. You had that question that you were saving. Makiko, we don't have much time, but ask her the question.
I just wanted to ask why you're still single.
Because I cannot find, I'm looking for, but I still don't meet the fatal man. And also, I was born, I had a kind of partner, that the man that maybe I can marry, but he say, the priority of life, because in Japan,
Makiko, we didn't want to go into your entire private life because that would be very rude of us. But are you hopeful, yes or no? Are you hopeful for the future? Oh, that's a shrug.
Maybe.
To be further discussed.
Maybe or maybe not.
Oh, my heart is breaking now for the beautiful Makiko. But Makiko, hold that thought for one moment. How is the community reacting to the conversation?
Well, there is a question on why the rest of the world might care about this. A good answer for the post show. Prince says this will have a consequence on the global economy in the long run. Even Japanese productive workforce is at risk.
So thank you very much to all of our guests. We are taking you all to the post show because this conversation has just started to get interesting. Let me tell you what we're doing on Monday. On the next show, some members of Canada's Indigenous population say that a genocide was committed against their people and that it's time for the UN to recognise it. We'll have more on that story on Monday. But right now, we head to the post show at stream.aljazeera.com. Thanks for watching. Hello again, this is the Stream's online post show. We have been talking about relationships in Japan, and a recent government survey suggests that many young Japanese are not in romantic relationships, and we're trying to find out what's causing this trend and what impact this will have on Japan's future as well as the rest of the world. So our guest, just to remind you, Roland Keltz, author of Japan America, How Japanese Culture Has Invaded the US. Tomomi Yamaguchi is an associate professor of anthropology at Montana State University. Morley Robertson is a journalist and musician, and Makiko Sagawa is an independent journalist. Now, Makiko went out and about in Tokyo. I don't think she's had any sleep for the last 24 hours. Thank you, Makiko, so much. I'm going to play you a little clip of some of the things that she asked some of the young people she met about sex and relationships in Japan. Have a look at this.
確かにそれがなくてもいいっていう人は多いんじゃないかな。なくてもいい人も多いです。なくてもよくないんですけど、別にそれが第一にはならない。子供を産んだ女の人はもうしたくないから拒否で多分しないので、友達に聞くとやっぱりしない人の方が多いです。
So Morley, so we're talking about sex here, and these young people are kind of ambivalent about it. And these two beautiful young women are saying, like, if you get married, you're never going to have sex again. So I am just, and your point is really intriguing, because you're saying this is all overblown. Why do you say that?
Because the changes taking place in Japan right now are very complex. There are many layers of changes. You know, Japan is a society in flux right now, maybe at a deeper level than it has changed like in the last 20 or 30 years. Things are about to things look like they're going to get out of the 20 years of stagnancy. So a lot of rules are changing. Also, gender roles and gender power balances seem to be changing in many layers of society. So I think that younger people are receiving contradictory signals. The mass media in Japan is very conservative and tends to extend reality from the last decades into the next decade, whereas the reality on the ground is, changing. What you get from the web is very dynamic, more globalized, whereas what you get from Japanese mass media tends to be centralized and, values inherited from older generations. That it's that gap of the two realities competing against each other, which I think is confusing the younger people and making them, less aggressive and less adventurous. That's my take on it.
Morley, it's so interesting that you just mentioned what you called contradictory signals, because that's exactly what our community members picked up on. On the one hand, Sashi on Twitter says, sex is a major and successful business in Japan. What youngsters are running away from is commitment, not sex. On the other hand, Roland, there's a video comment here who gives us a kind of a different side of it. Have a listen to this.
I think the problem is that Japan is not open to sexual topics, because I feel they are not willing to talk about these kind of issues. And like topics like STD, when I live in Western countries, I saw some kind of campaign to raise awareness of STD, but here in Japan, I don't see often, more like never. I could be wrong, but that's my impressions.
So Roland, there's clearly a dichotomy here.
Yeah, well, I mean, again, part of it is cultural. Discretion is prized in Japan, perhaps a little bit more so than it is certainly in the United States. Mm-hmm. And part of it, I think, to Morley's point, there's these two competing narratives. I think that's an excellent point. The conservative mainstream media on the one hand, and this explosive community online. Japan is home to the top 5 Twitter accounts in the world. Japan also holds the record
which is the top 5?
The top 5, I guess, most active, most popular Twitter accounts. Japan is home to the top 5. Wow. Also holds the record for the most tweets per second.
Wow.
By the way.
Okay.
Completely blew the old record out of the water.
This is why people don't have time for relationships.
Exactly. Well, that's an excellent point. But there's also a bulletin board site called 2Channel, which is enormously popular in Japan. It's the most active bulletin board site in the world. So a lot of, I think, younger Japanese in particular feel like there's this new domain in which they can communicate what is not being said in the mainstream media. And I think Morley's point, again, is really excellent, which is that it's incredibly confusing. You've got a mainstream media that's saying one thing, that Japan is still in 1985, basically, growth is going to happen again, don't worry. And then you've got these voices online which are completely candid. I mean, very, very open. And usually you can post anonymously. So you maintain the discretion publicly, but online you can go nuts.
Right.
I'd like to add to Roland's statement about the channel two channel. It's called Nichannel in Japan. Unfortunately, there's a dark side to all this anonymous posting. People can become very vicious, and they can troll one another in a very vicious way. So what I'm saying is that more free speech open to the relatively younger generation doesn't yield to pretty results all the time. Sometimes racism runs amok. So there's a light and dark side to this new media, as opposed to the mainstream television media, which is controlled and censored.
Tomomi, what did you want to add to our conversation?
Racism counts for both TV, media, and also the internet. So it's not the kind media for women, many women especially. And I think what's missing from this discussion, and also all the media coverage on this, is the rural voices from Japan. Because what the area which is most struggling with the low birth rate is really rural Japan, and the lack of young people there, and that's all the voices from there is totally lacking.
I really love that you said that, because Malika and I, we were chatting about all the comments that had come in, and there was one that was a very specific one saying, don't just talk about Tokyo.
Right, exactly.
Talk about the rest of Japan.
Exactly.
Tokyo and media, and that's it.
And then how would that change our view, or how would that change the conversation then if we started talking about rural Japan as well?
Rural Japan, I mean, it's really struggling, and number of young people are decreasing. There's no jobs there, so young people have to go out of the rural areas, and it's pretty depressing. And with the Fukushima incident and also the earthquake, tsunami, I thought that some struggles of the rural Japan got highlighted by the media, but I was wrong, I guess, with this whole reaction that rural Japan is totally ignored in this.
Well, just as Femi mentioned, we do have that comment from rural Japan, and he explains that it is different there, and all of our guests have a listen or read the subtitles.
Hello, I'm Japanese university student, 21 age. The article read by some media on Japanese youth is a biased joke. Of course, some people do not want to get married, but my friend in hometown want to have direct interaction and get married as soon as possible. Japan is diverse because of its geography. It should not be judged based on some people in one part of Tokyo. Thank you.
So Roland, he mentions it is different where he lives. His friends do want to have that interaction and relationships.
Yeah. I mean, it's an excellent point that the media basically ignores rural Japan, and that's where the population crisis is most deeply felt. The irony about the population issue is that the population of Tokyo is actually going up. So when you're in a train station in Tokyo, the idea that the population could shrink is actually quite attractive, because it's overcrowded, and the young people who are from those rural areas are pouring into the city to try to get work. It also creates a certain level of anomie or loneliness in urban life in Japan, because these people leave their towns and they end up living in usually tiny apartments and massive housing blocks and hardly get to know anyone. So there's also a dark side in the city to the depletion of rural Japan.
Sure. I want to go around our guests, because everyone has a slightly different perspective, and it's been fascinating listening to you. What's the one thought that you want to leave us with for this conversation? Because this debate is going to go rolling on and on and on. Other people will see articles. What do you want us to know, Roland, when we start reading other stories that you feel will give us insight?
Well, I think as someone alluded to earlier, that what this story is not exclusive to Japan. It's what developed nations around the world are facing. And also the idea that Japan may be worth watching because it's actually ahead of the curve.
Yeah.
It's actually where a lot of the world is headed. And, Japan has often been a place to watch for that reason.
Tell me that name of that word again. Mandachi.
Mendokusai?
Mendokusai.
Yes.
That's going to be my new phrase.
Okay.
So, Tomomi, what's your closing thought that we should remember? Don't give us a lot of questions, just a thought, so that we can be more informed when we see this discussion going around the world.
Oh, this thought?
Yeah, your closing thought. Your last piece of insight. Yes.
Okay, yeah, I think it's, I was surprised to see this whole discussion going on so much on the internet and everywhere. But then at the same time, it may be a good thing to really focus on what's going on in Japan currently, and also the gender relations in Japan and the struggles of women especially, but also for men and any people with other genders as well. So we really should learn a little, really more about the context, historical context, and the current situation.
Wonderful.
Japan.
Makiko, thank you for not only just being on the program, but doing some reporting for us. What's your closing thought you want to leave us with about this conversation?
Okay, it's about the one thing I want to correct. And according to some westernized newspaper, Japan is a sexless, right? It's one of the most sexless country in the world, but it's only among couples it's sexless. But based on my own personal interview with many young people, and people just, like there are many kind of like sex relationships, like in many sex industry, for instance, everywhere just exists. And so in Japan we have honne tatemae, with honest feeling and tatemae. And all the young people I interview agree that it's sexless and Japan is no sex. This is tatemae. It's just a polite face.
I understand.
I'm sorry.
You're claiming back the sexiness for Japan, and you're welcome to have it. So I'm not going to argue on that part. And Morley, we started with you. We're going to end with you. What's the last piece of insight you're going to give us before we wrap the whole show up?
I think that Japan is coming out of isolation, and I say that because a lot of these symptoms we've talked about, I believe, are a result of Japan's cultural isolation, which has actually lasted between 50 and 100 years, the way, depending on how you look at it. Japan is being forced out of isolation through, trade agreements with the United States and surrounding countries. The global economy is just tearing Japan out of its old paradigm. Japan will be forced to change by outside forces in the coming decade. And hence, I think the climate, the environment, the dynamic is changing rapidly in Japan, and therefore the younger people will have a lot of positive things to look forward to. I think Japan will become sexy because it is coming out of cultural isolation.
Well, thank you, Mr. Meat Eater, Molly Robertson. Appreciate your input. To Makiko Sagawa, Roland Kautz, and to Mimi Yamaguchi, thank you very much for being part of this conversation, and to our community as well. Where will we take you on Monday? Well, on the next program, some members of Canada's Indigenous population say that a genocide was committed against their people and that it's time for the UN to recognise it. We will have more on this story on Monday. Until then, we'll see you online. Thanks for watching. Take care.